Making it in Hollywood has always been an incredible long shot. But it was especially true back in what is now referred to as the Golden Age. Glamour was in, and Humphrey Bogart didn't fit the mold.
Bogart was below average height. He wore a rug. He had a scar. He had a lisp. He was kind of undistinguished, except that in a peculiar way, you wanted to look at him.
In a way, when you put all the elements of Humphrey Bogart together, he's a preposterous model for a movie star. How did somebody like that have a mystique? I think it's partly that that face radiated a very complicated inner life, and audiences read it, that those eyes saw lots of things, and audiences were interested in finding out what those eyes saw.
He was not a young star. He took serious parts, and he had lived his life so that he had character lines, and he had the look in his eye of a guy who'd been there and might really have done some of these things.
The drinking and the constant smoking certainly helped give his face that lived-in look. But he also understood how to stay on top in Hollywood. He was not above wearing lifts in his shoes if he had a tall leading lady, or wearing a toupee to hide his receding hairline. But these were just more props in the hands of a skilled actor.
Yeah, he made everything work for him. He had oversized caps, you see, because back in those days, they weren't as good as they are today, you know, they look so natural. And he had a habit of going like this, you know, if something is protruding, you would do the same thing, you know, go like that.
If Bogart was ever insecure about his appearance, he never let on.
My name is Humphrey Bogart, in case of those of you in the audience who are either too young or too old to know who I am.
His personality more than made up for any physical shortcomings.
There was a strength and a pushiness, really, in the Bogart, wasn't there? You know what I mean? He came on. He took over in every way. With voice, had a great voice. It was strong. It was manly.
Now talk.
Oh, how can you accuse me of such a terrible...
This isn't the time for that schoolgirl act. We're both of us sitting under the gallows.
That edge in his voice was not just part of his characters. Writers learned to come up with dialogue for Bogart's way of delivering a line. And in real life, he honed his skill on many unsuspecting victims.
Oh, he liked to give people a business and see what they do, you know, so get reactions. Reactions were very important to him. You know, get two people together and kind of watch them go. I mean, he did that an awful lot.
But without a doubt, the most amazing aspect of Bogart's success is his staying power and appeal to modern audiences.
Because he's just cool. Humphrey Bogart is just cool. He's slick, he's cool. The women love him and the guys want to be him.
It's interesting. Why is he still cool? I mean, the toughness is really what's important, I think, because as tough as he is in the pictures and the quintessential films of his, he's still hurt. You know he's hurt. He covers it, he moves on, and he deals with it, he lives with it. And added to that, there's a sense of irony, the wisdom of irony. The world is tough, inevitably it's fatalistic, but once you understand that, we can maybe make it through.
Bogey was really one of the first anti-heroes, if not the first anti-hero. Back then, if you were good, you know, the good guys wore white hats, the bad guys wore black hats. But Bogey was able to wear a white hat and a black hat. He was the killer who you kind of sympathized with. He was the first guy really to do that.
Trying to separate the man, the movie star, and the myth has never been easy. But people are still endlessly curious about how Bogart became Bogart.
In every man's life, there are pinpoints of time that govern his destiny. In his adolescence and his youth, a push to the right, a life of honor and credit.
He is so much a part of American pop culture that it is hard to believe that he died almost 50 years ago. It's even harder to believe that the ultimate screen tough guy was born on Christmas Day 2 centuries ago, on December 25th, 1899.
Bogey has this reputation as this tough guy, but actually he was born in Manhattan in a very a nice part of Manhattan. His father was a doctor, his mother was an illustrator.
His mother, Maud Humphreys, gave her little boy her family name and his first bit of fame as one of her models.
Interesting enough, he started off as an adorable little baby. We can see this in the illustrations by his mother. He was at one point identified as the Gerber baby model, but we now know that's not true.
His parents sent him to exclusive private schools in Manhattan, but he did little to distinguish himself. By the end of the 12th grade, he was definitely not college-bound. His father managed to get his underachieving son into his old prep school in Massachusetts, but Humphrey was soon asked to leave.
He got kicked out of Andover because he was a little too rambunctious, shall we say. You know, he liked to have a lot of fun, much like his son. Although I wasn't kicked out of anywhere, he's still like that. At any rate, he was kicked out of Andover, and he went to the Navy.
18-year-old Humphrey was assigned to the USS Leviathan to help bring the troops home from Europe at the end of World War I. Later, stories about how he got his scarred lip and lisp were often attributed to this tour of duty.
I think I read a couple of stories whereby some German prisoner asked him for a match, and he was handcuffed, and as he gave him the light to a cigarette, he smashed him in the mouth. One of the more common theories is that he was injured in a bar fight, which is probably closer to the truth.
I mean, come on, bar fights, I mean, Andover, you know, you look at pictures of my father, he's not a bar fight kind of guy. I think it's the prison thing.
After being discharged from the Navy, he soon found work as a stage manager at a Broadway theater. He landed his first acting role in 1922 and began to work his way up by playing boyish society types. In 1926, he married Helen Menken, the first of his 4 actress wives. She was a more established stage actor, and their marriage took a back seat to their careers. After a year and a half, they got a divorce, and just 5 months later, Bogart married another respected stage actress, Mary Phillips. In early 1929, they played a married couple in the play Skyrocket. It quickly fizzled out. That fall, the stock market crashed and took theater attendance down with it. Luckily for Bogart, Hollywood was searching Broadway for actors to put in their new talking pictures. In 1930, he left for Hollywood, but his wife Mary refused to give up her stage career and stayed behind. Humphrey Bogart was about to learn that success in Hollywood can be a very long and bumpy road. After 8 years of no real breakthroughs on Broadway, 20th Century Fox brought Humphrey Bogart out to Hollywood. The only lasting thing during this first failed attempt to make it in the movies was his friendship with Spencer Tracy. It was Tracy that gave him the nickname Bogey. Columbia Pictures gave him a second chance, but 6 months later, he was back on Broadway. In September of 1934, Bogart got word that his father was dying of heart disease, and he rushed to his side. Bogart's father died in his arms. It had been a rough few years, and his stage career, like his first 2 attempts in Hollywood, seemed to be going nowhere.
But then he got lucky. Arthur Hopkins, the producer of The Petrified Forest, the new play by Robert Sherwood, remembered seeing Bogart in a small part, and somehow he envisioned Bogart playing this ruthless killer on the run, and he was an overnight success. He was a sensation.
Bogey really looked like John Dillinger a lot. And you can see in The Petrified Forest, he came out with the beard, the 5 o'clock shadow. And when he came on stage, the audience just gasped. No one ever seen anybody like that.
But when Warner Brothers bought the film rights, they wanted their already established star, Edward G. Robinson, to play Duke Mantee. Luckily, English actor Leslie Howard, the lead in the play and the upcoming movie, insisted Bogart also be in the movie version.
What's the matter with you, Duke? Do something! Shut up! Shut up! Give me time to think!
No, Duke, you want revenge, don't you?
His presence on the screen is electric. He fills the screen. You know, and you feel immediately that here's an enormous star presence.
Just keep in mind that I and the boys is candidates for hanging. The first time any one of you makes a wrong move, I'm gonna kill the whole lot of you.
It was the first time it happened. It took a while for him to ripen into Humphrey Bogart.
The right answer, Johnny.
Warner Brothers signed Bogart to a 7-year contract, and he began making movie after movie. For the most part, he ended up being killed off by the big stars of the era, James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. Two of his more interesting films during this period were when Warner's let him work for other studios in 1937. Bogart got good reviews, playing a gangster named Babyface Martin in the United Artists release Dead End. Then he portrayed a harried movie executive opposite his friend Leslie Howard in a witty Hollywood satire called Stand-In.
You ain't getting in here again.
Aside, my friend. I stand on my constitutional rights.
Go away or you'll be sitting on them.
Okay, sugar, it's a deadlock.
But back at Warner's, he was becoming increasingly frustrated with the parts the studio assigned him. Westerns proved that he was not meant to be a cowboy. And playing a modern-day vampire in The Return of Dr. X was not the change of pace he was looking for. Once again, he felt his movie career was floundering. It was while he was working on the film Marked Woman, he became involved with actress Mayo Murtho. He divorced Mary Phillips and jumped into a third marriage. It quickly became a contentious relationship, drenched in alcohol and jealousy.
And I think they just, you know, two kind of souls that were lost found each other at that time. And they stayed together, and it was a lot of drinking, you know, a little violence every once in a while, you know, but that was all drink-fueled.
Bogart worried that he was about to strike out in Hollywood for the third time. But another movie tough guy of the era unintentionally started giving him the breaks he needed.
The story of the many ways that George Raft managed to outsmart himself and promote Humphrey Bogart almost makes it seem as if there is some kind of a hand of destiny guiding our careers. Because at every turn, over a period of several years involving several pictures, George Raft was wrong, 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 and it was good, good, good for Bogey.
Tired of playing gangsters, Raft turned down High Sierra. So Warner Brothers gave the part of Roy Earl to Bogart.
I'm giving you a chance to blow. If you decide to stick, I'll shoot the first one that don't do as I tell him.
High Sierra, which is a terrific film, is terrific partly because it represented the end of a tradition, the beginning of a new one. It was the end of the classic gangster cycle. We could say almost that it's the first of Bogart's anti-hero heroes, that the character also achieves a great deal of nobility and stature, and he's a gangster.
Bogart proved he could carry a picture, but it was thanks again to George Raft that he was catapulted into stardom. One of the screenwriters of High Sierra was going to direct his first film. Raft didn't feel he should work with a novice, so once again, Bogart got the part. It was a bad career move for Raft because the young director was John Huston, and his first movie was The Maltese Falcon.
What have you ever given me beside money? Have you ever given me any of your confidence, any of the truth? Haven't you tried to buy my loyalty with money and nothing else?
What else is there I can buy you with?
With his portrayal of Sam Spade, Bogart created the modern movie detective.
Suddenly, with Maltese Falcon, with John Huston working together with him, it was something of our present time, a coolness, an awareness that it sort of grew up all of a sudden. And he took on the mantle of a generation, really.
We were talking about a lot more money than this.
There are more of us to be taken care of now.
Well, that may be, but I've got the Falcon.
You may have the Falcon, but we certainly have you.
The team of director John Huston and Humphrey Bogart was on its way to becoming one of the most creative relationships in movie history.
How can you accuse
Huston and Bogart were both men's men. They had a lot of women in their lives, but they were guys. They liked to drink. They both liked to drink a whole lot, and they drank a whole lot together, and that cemented a bond between them, I think, that was very important. But they were also smart people. They were well-read, they were thoughtful people. who were undoubtedly able to have conversations about things other than the picture they were working on.
2 months after the Maltese Falcon opened, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Luckily for the movie-going public, Bogart, then in his early 40s, was too old to serve in the military. At the beginning of 1942, Bogart signed a new contract with Warner Brothers for $2,750 a week. But the studio still controlled what films he would appear in. Early that year, he made a forgettable film called The Big Shot. Next was Across the Pacific with John Huston, just before the director began his wartime service. Then, in May, Bogart reported to work on another B picture being shot on the Warner's backlot in Burbank, California. The rest of the cast wasn't set yet, the script was not finished, and even its title, Everybody Comes to Rick's, would end up changing to Casablanca.
I was willing to shoot Captain Reno, and I'm willing to shoot you. All right, Major, you asked for it.
He was the perfect Rick because he was able to combine self-pity with heroism. When you look at Rick sitting there late at night in Rick's place, drunk, remembering Ilsa in Paris, remembering how much he had lost, he can play that hurt, that vulnerability, that guy who will never be able to bounce back. And at the same time, you see inside of him that idealism. He has the cynicism that says, I stick my neck out for nobody, but at the same time, he sticks his neck way out. And that transition was the sort of thing that Bogart was so good at.
Casablanca was a hit, and Bogart was now a romantic leading man. He had worried that in an era where the star always got the girl, Casablanca's ending might hurt, not help his career. Of course, nothing about Casablanca's success was conventional. Things were looking up for Bogart, and in real life, he was about to get the girl. The only problem was that he was still married to a woman whose jealous rages were more than just empty threats. With hits like The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca to his credit, 1943 should have been a great year for Bogart. Instead, his next 3 films did nothing to further his career. Now a star, he battled directly with Warner Brothers studio head Jack Warner.
Back then, the studio system was horrible. Obviously, it gave people their start, but that's the only place they could go. The actors were indentured servants, and I respect him for fighting with Jack Warner, for continually refusing to buckle under to the system. He wasn't stupid, though. He waited until he had the power to do it. And he just bucked him and bucked him and bucked him at every turn.
While fighting with the front office by day, Bogart's marriage with Mayo was another source of continuing conflict. They were becoming notorious for fighting in public, and the violence was escalating.
In Hollywood, we call them the battling Bogarts. And one time, Richard Arlen, who was one of our big leading men here, and I and Bogey, we're going to have dinner, which we often did. The 3 of us often had dinner. And Bogey was late, which was very unusual. He was very punctual. And he arrived about a half hour late. And he had 4 scratches from his hairline all the way down his face. And his shirt was bloody. He arrived and said, Dick, AC, I'm sorry I'm late, but he said, I had to take Mayo to the hospital. She has a broken jaw. So just looking at him with the scratches and the blood, and he's saying it had you knew, you could picture what had happened.
Their volatile marriage even spilled over into Bogart's public service efforts during the war.
How are our boys doing?
During the Second World War, they had these USO tours. Her and Bogart went on these tours, you know. And would you believe it? They got kicked out of the U.S. tour for fighting.
Bogart's behavior was worrying some of his friends. His drinking was out of control. And sooner or later, Mayo, who had already pulled a gun on him and scarred him with a knife, might have just finished him off. At this point in his life, getting involved with a teenage girl should have been his final downfall, but it turned out to be his salvation. Aspiring actress Betty Persky had a new stage name, Lauren Bacall, and her big break was a starring role in To Have and Have Not.
I'm hard to get, Steve.
All you have to do is ask me.
You know what you're getting into.
Howard Hawks wanted to find an actress who could hold her own with Bogart, and amazingly, he found this 19-year-old New York girl, hard as nails, tough as they make them, obviously filled with self-confidence, and she held her own against this movie icon.
She met my father, and it was probably not love at first sight, but love at second sight. You know, I mean, the first sight, it's like, what's with this old guy? And the second time, it's like, whoa.
What'd you do that for?
Been wondering whether I'd like it.
What's the decision?
I don't know yet.
A director knows what's happening. And Howard Hawks always said, the minute I saw Humphrey Bogart, the minute I saw Lauren Bacall, it was like Chinese firecrackers going off, and I knew I had the chemistry that I needed and wanted for this picture.
In reality, what we're seeing is a real seduction go on. And there's nothing that you could make up that would be better than that. And here you have this extraordinary seduction happening with the dialogue and just the body language. I mean, this is lovemaking.
In the fall of 1944, Bogart donned his detective's trench coat for the second time and became the quintessential Philip Marlowe in the screen adaptation of Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep.
Sometimes I wonder what strange fate brought me out of the storm to that house that stood alone in the shadows. As I probed into its mysteries, every clue told me a different story. But each had the same ending: murder.
Lauren Bacall was again his co-star. On screen, as Marlowe, Bogey was the personification of cool, never revealing that behind the scenes, his marriage to Mayo was crumbling in trial separations and fits of jealousy.
Lauren Bacall tells the story. The phone rings in the middle of the night. It's Mayo. She's screaming at her, saying, "Who's going to wash his socks? Are you going to take care of him?"
As The Big Sleep wrapped production in January of 1945, the battling Bogarts finally called a truce. On May 10th, Mayo gave Bogey a divorce. Just 11 days later, 45-year-old Bogart married 20-year-old Bacall at a friend's farm in Ohio. The attempt to keep it a small, quiet affair failed, and the wedding party became outnumbered by reporters and photographers. The public embraced the glamorous couple. Warner's decided to rework The Big Sleep. New scenes were shot with Bogart and Bacall to take advantage of their popularity.
I like that. I'd like more.
1946 was a good year for Bogart. The Big Sleep was big at the box office. Bogey put his prints at Grauman's Chinese Theater. Bogart and Bacall got to work together again on Dark Passage. 1946 was also the year that Bogart was finally in a position to get what he wanted from Warner Brothers. He signed a new contract that made him the highest paid actor in the world, gave him director and script approval, and the right to work for another studio once a year. He celebrated by buying himself a 55-foot sailboat, the Santana.
His favorite thing to do was to go sailing. And he could go where he wanted to go, and that was his escape, and he loved it. It was his recreation, and it was his passion.
Bogart was also getting more involved with politics.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
When the House of Un-American Activities Committee started their communist witch hunt in Hollywood, Bogart and Bacall were willing to use their star status to help call attention to the injustice being done.
John Huston formed the committee for the First Amendment, and we chartered a plane, and we went to Washington and sat in where this committee was conducting itself, because it was also attacking Hollywood for writing commie movies. You know, well, it was utter nonsense.
But public opinion began to sway against the outspoken actors. Dark Passage wasn't doing very well at the box office. In December, Bogart recanted and said his actions were ill-advised.
he wouldn't really have swung around in his thinking. But he did have a career. He did have to earn money. He had people he was supporting. There was that part of it.
In his next two films with John Huston, it's almost as if they were re-examining Bogart's persona of the guy who would always end up doing the right thing. In Key Largo, it wasn't until the very end of the picture that Bogart finally stood up to Edward G. Robinson's gangster character, Rocco. In The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, Bogart took a risky next step when he played Fred C. Dobbs, a character that goes beyond redemption.
Shut your trap! Shut up or I'll smash your head flat! Go ahead, throw it! Without me, you two would die here more miserable than rats!
Leave him alone. Can't you see the old man's nuts?
And we watch our hero, in a way. You like Bogart. You really like him. And you watch Fred C. Dobbs go downhill. And you go with him. You go with him because he's going to teach us a lesson about greed and life. But in order to teach us that lesson, he's going to have to take the dive. He's going to have to go down.
I know exactly what you mean. You want to take it all for yourself and cut me out. I know you for what you are. A long time I've had my suspicions about you. Now I know I've been right.
By the time he's, hooking up his mules and he's talking to himself and he says, you have to get up pretty early in the morning to put one over on Fred C. Dobbs. Let me tell you. By that time, you know he's gone. And he's not coming back, And he sacrifices himself for us in a way, Bogart, in that film. And it's very courageous.
Aside from these two classic films with Huston in the late 40s, Bogart was still not happy with the quality of the other films Warner Brothers was offering him. He decided to take more control and was the first actor to form his own production company. But then, Bogart was suddenly confronted with a role he felt he was not prepared for. Lauren Bacall was pregnant with their first child. In the late 1940s, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall were Hollywood royalty. When, at almost 50, Bogart was about to become a father for the first time, it was big news.
Harry Truman and my father made a bet on whether I'd be a boy or a girl. My father bet I'd be a girl. Harry Truman bet I'd be a boy. Obviously, Harry Truman won. So my father sent him a check for $20. And Harry Truman sent back the check, co-signed on the back with a letter from the White House saying how much he respects a man who remembers his debts and pays them. It's pretty amazing.
Stephen Humphrey Bogart was born on January 6th in 1949. Fatherhood was a rough transition for Bogart. It was still an era in which real men didn't change diapers, except in posed studio publicity pictures.
He was very happy to become a father, but he was scared. He didn't know what to do. He was kind of in awe, shall we say, of the little thing. And crying babies and stuff like that. I don't think that he was really into that part of it, It was like, let me wait a little bit till the kid gets a little older and we can really start to talk and stuff.
If his fans feared that fatherhood might mellow their hero, Bogey, headlines 8 months after the birth proved they had nothing to worry about. While in New York, Bogart dropped in at a night spot named the El Morocco, carrying a big stuffed panda bear he bought for his son.
So he sat at his booth with his drink and his panda, and an actress named Robin Roberts, who wanted publicity and who had, according to testimony in court, been set up by the nightclub, came over to his table and said something like, "I want your panda," and she tried to grab it. And Bogart, who was half in the bag, grabbed it back, and they had a tug of war, and he told her, "You're not going to get my panda, this is for my kid." And according to her testimony, he knocked her down. The judge threw the case out. He said there was no basis to it. But for 3 days, it was a 3 days wonder.
There was a great deal of attention given to it because it's such an outrageous story. But Bogart was asked, were you drunk at the time? And Bogart's great answer is, isn't everyone at 3 a.m. in the morning?
These kinds of exploits may have helped him prepare for one of his most famous roles, the hard-drinking old rascal Charlie Allnut in The African Queen. Director John Huston's quest for realism led Bogey and co-star Katharine Hepburn to remote parts of Africa for months. Surviving the production became an ordeal nearly as dramatic as the film itself. Almost everybody came down with dysentery.
Bogey and Houston were the only two that did not get sick, you know, because they didn't drink the water. Basically, they were drinking something else, and we know what that was.
Hepburn's subtitle to the hit book she would later write about her experiences probably summed it up best. How I Went to Africa with Bogart, Bacall, and Houston, and almost lost my mind. But for Bogart, working with Houston once again paid off. And at the age of 53, he won his one and only Academy Award.
He never thought that he would win an Oscar. He was stunned and happy and proud and everything, although he probably never would have admitted it.
Bacall, pregnant with their second child, a daughter they would name Leslie, convinced Bogart to move from Benedict Canyon to Holmby Hills. It was a neighborhood full of stars, and across the street was radio and television personality Art Linkletter.
He was a kind of a remote guy. He was living in his big house, and we didn't see much of him. But we had an argument, a serious argument, about a dog.
The dogs would bark. We had 3 boxers, and boxers are barkers. And they would keep the neighborhood up.
So I would call up Mr. Bogart and suggest that he put his dog in the basement. And he suggested that I mind my own business. I threatened to call the downtown police. He says, go ahead and call him. And they sent out a detective. And when he found out it was Bogart, he said, Mr. Linkletter, he said, you don't really want to have Mr. Bogart arrested or have charges placed against him. And I said, well, what am I going to do? I can't sleep. He says, I would advise you that you probably should not hire somebody to drive by late at night and throw a steak over into the Bogart home with some poison in it. I said, no, I won't do that. I said, but thanks for warning me.
What's happened, Peter?
Bogart indulged his eccentric side and made Beat the Devil with John Huston. The public didn't embrace the confusing and quirky film. At this stage of his career, Bogart was interested in taking roles other than the tough guy characters he had become famous for. He caught his fans off guard again when he played Captain Queeg in the 1953 screen version of The Caine Mutiny.
Here was an actor who, no matter what, managed to keep his cool, managed to keep himself under control. That was part of the appeal of his persona. And here he's shredding it. He's unraveling it for us.
Mr. Merrick, you're under arrest. Go below to your cabin. Call your relief, Mr. Keith. You're under arrest, too. You'll all hang for conspiracy to mutiny.
You expect him to pull through, and he can't. He doesn't, given that character. And it makes it much more unnerving for the audience.
For his next film, he went to the other extreme and played a buttoned-down businessman in Sabrina, even if his cynical side didn't quite let him buy into the story.
I saw Bogey walking down the street here at Paramount, and I stopped him and we talked. And he said, I just saw in the projection room Sabrina. He said, wonderful picture. And I said, you were great in it. He said, there's only one question I have about the picture. I said, what? He said, no, in the picture, I get Audrey Hepburn. I said, yeah. He said, had I been Audrey Hepburn, I would have taken Bill Holden. I wouldn't have taken me.
He got another Academy Award nomination for his portrayal of Captain Queeg, and the public loved Sabrina. Bogart was as hot as ever. He decided to end his contract with Warner Brothers early. The next month, he appeared on The Jack Benny Show and enjoyed parodying his screen image.
Now, what did you do with that gun? Now, wait a minute before you start any rough stuff. I'm entitled to one phone call, ain't I?
Well, yes.
Okay, give me a dime and I'll run down to the drugstore. Oh, no, you don't.
Finally, Bogart seemed relaxed and happy. He was free to do whatever he wanted, but as it would turn out, he had little time left to enjoy his career or his family. After successfully gaining respect as a skilled actor willing to take risks in roles like the Caine Mutiny and the African Queen, Bogart decided to return to the kind of part that first made him popular.
It was interesting about Humphrey Bogart coming to Desperate Hours. It had been done on the stage and beautifully done by Paul Newman, who was younger than Bogey. And some people had the imagination of a younger person in that part. And Bogey came in.
His performance in The Desperate Hours proved that at age 54, Bogart could still take command of the screen as the head of a gang. During his off hours, he was the ringleader of a group of party animals that would become known as the Rat Pack.
How did the Rat Pack originate? Well, the story is that Bogart was in Vegas with Judy Garland and David Niven and Frank Sinatra and Lauren Bacall, and they were on a roll. They were on a tear. They were tearing up the town. They were painting the town red. It lasted for 5 days, and at the end of 5 days, they came straggling back to the hotel suite where Lauren Bacall, who was a lot younger than the others, looked at them and said, "Geez, you look like a Rat Pack," and that's how it was named. And Bogart, of course, was the leader of the Rat Pack until his death, and then Frank Sinatra took over, and he sort of initiated the next Rat Pack.
On Memorial Day in 1955, Bogart played Duke Mantee for the third time in a live television version of The Petrified Forest. Lauren Bacall took over the Bette Davis role. After he made the film The Harder They Fall, Bogart and Bacall planned their first big screen reunion in 8 years.
My mother kind of let her career go on hold to raise the kids. She decided that she wasn't going to be a working mom and wasn't going to leave us alone all the time. That's what my father wanted, and that's what they agreed to. Of course, by the time she was going to get back into it, my father got sick.
Soundtech 833.
Bogart and Bacall were going to appear together in the romantic comedy Melville Goodwin, USA. In January of 1956, they reported to Warner Brothers for wardrobe tests, but they never got to make the film. The cause of a persistent cough turned out to be cancer of the esophagus. In February, Bogart was operated on at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. The prognosis wasn't good. Even though they tried to keep Bogey's condition quiet, the word slowly got out.
When we learned that Bogey was ill, probably terminally ill, there was such sadness in this whole business. But if you knew Bogey, you really didn't believe that this was a terminal illness, because we all believed that Bogey in person was as strong in person as he was that character that we saw on the screen, and he could conquer anything. He could do anything.
Lauren Bacall was very warm, and I want to say a word about her now because many movie stars, when the going gets tough, kind of vanish from the scene. But when he was dying of cancer, she stayed in there. And I have a great deal of admiration for the way she comforted him and took care of him in a rather lengthy death. It was sad and painful.
Well, it wasn't fun. I'll tell you that. I mean, you know, you have someone dying upstairs and it happens to be your father. That's not a good way to live for a year. I didn't really get to see him that much at the end because he didn't want me to see him like that or whatever. I remember him in bed a couple times and in the, you know, coming down the dumbwaiter in a chair. But that last year, it's difficult to remember.
After several months out of the public eye, Humphrey Bogart passed away at home on January 14th, 1957. His funeral turned into a major Hollywood media event. A parade of stars made their way through the public and press to pay their respects. Where a casket would normally be, stood a model of his beloved boat, the Santana.
He wanted to be cremated, which he was, and have his ashes buried at sea. But for some reason, it wasn't legal to do that. I have no idea why. It seems like kind of an innocuous thing. So he's at Forest Lawn, where he remains today, under lock and key. My mother has the key.
He was the first of the superstar celebrities to die before their time. Like Marilyn and Elvis, who would follow, Bogart was destined to become an icon.
When you die young, in your glory, the way you became popular, the way you became a big star, and you disappear looking like that, you're more apt to go down in history as that, aren't you?
Over the last few decades, images of Bogart have again permeated our culture.
It was really Woody Allen's Play It Again, Sam in 1972 that revived him as a great star and as a legend. And so he became, forever after, associated with that trench-coated figure that Woody Allen creates for the film.
Often, it has been up to Bogart impersonators, like actor Robert Sacchi, to bring him back to life.
He's looking at you, kid.
And somehow, Bogey, the tough guy, the gangster, the bad boy, has become sought after as a straight-talking commercial spokesman for everything from a new line of furniture to watches.
In his movies, he always was the guy that didn't want to screw with another guy. You know, it was a fair deal, a handshake, you know, and things like that. So he has a lot of credibility as a spokesman for a product.
With the continued interest in his old movies, the endless stream of images and advertising and pop culture, Bogart seems to be here to stay. And with the continuing advancements in computer imaging, who knows how long it will be before Bogart stars in his next film. Humphrey Bogart, the movie star, lives on, while Bogart, the man, continues to be a fascinating enigma.
I think the reason why Bogey has lasted so many years is that we really couldn't figure Bogey out. One minute we knew we had him, next minute he was gone. And I think that's why he's lasted all these years. We never really know who he was.
Making it in Hollywood has always been an incredible long shot. But it was especially true back in what is now referred to as the Golden Age. Glamour was in, and Humphrey Bogart didn't fit the mold.
Bogart was below average height. He wore a rug. He had a scar. He had a lisp. He was kind of undistinguished, except that in a peculiar way, you wanted to look at him.
In a way, when you put all the elements of Humphrey Bogart together, he's a preposterous model for a movie star. How did somebody like that have a mystique? I think it's partly that that face radiated a very complicated inner life, and audiences read it, that those eyes saw lots of things, and audiences were interested in finding out what those eyes saw.
He was not a young star. He took serious parts, and he had lived his life so that he had character lines, and he had the look in his eye of a guy who'd been there and might really have done some of these things.
The drinking and the constant... By the end of the 12th grade, he was definitely not college-bound. His father managed to get his underachieving son into his old prep school in Massachusetts, but Humphrey was soon asked to leave.
He got kicked out of Andover because he was a little too rambunctious, shall we say. You know, he liked to have a lot of fun, much like his son. Although I wasn't kicked out of anywhere, he's still like that. At any rate, he was kicked out of Andover, and he went to the Navy.
18-year-old Humphrey was assigned to the USS Leviathan to help bring the troops home from Europe at the end of World War I. Later, stories about how he got his scarred lip and lisp were often attributed to this tour of duty.
I think I read a couple of stories whereby some German prisoner asked him for a match, and he was handcuffed, and as he gave him the light to a cigarette, he smashed him in the mouth.
One of the more common theories is that he was injured in a bar fight, which is probably closer to the truth.
I mean, come on. Bar fights, I mean, Andover. You know, you look at pictures of my father, he's not a bar fight kind of guy. I think it's the prison thing.
After being discharged from the Navy, he soon found work as a stage manager at a Broadway theater. His smoking certainly helped give his face that lived-in look. But he also understood how to stay on top in Hollywood. He was not above wearing lifts in his shoes if he had a tall leading lady, or wearing a toupee to hide his receding hairline. But these were just more props in the hands of a skilled actor.
Yeah, he made everything work for him. He had oversized caps, you see, because back in those days, they weren't as good as they are today, you know, they look so natural. And he had a habit of going like this, you know, if something is protruding, you would do the same thing, you know, go like that.
If Bogart was ever insecure about his appearance, he never let on.
My name is Humphrey Bogart, in case those of you in the audience who are either too young or too old to know who I am.
His personality more than made up for any physical shortcomings.
There was a strength and a pushiness, really, in the Bogart, wasn't there? You know what I mean? He came on. He took over in every way. With voice, had a great voice. It was strong. It was manly.
Now talk.
Oh, how can you accuse me of such a terrible...
This isn't the time for that schoolgirl act with both of us sitting under the gallows.
That edge in his voice was not just part of his characters. Writers learned to come up with dialogue for Bogart's way of delivery.
To do that.
Trying to separate the man, the movie star, and the myth has never been easy. But people are still endlessly curious about how Bogart became Bogart.
In every man's life, there are pinpoints of time that govern his destiny. In his adolescence and his youth, a push to the right, a life of honor and credit.
He is so much a part of American pop culture that it is hard to believe that he died almost 50 years ago. It's even harder to believe that the ultimate screen tough guy was born on Christmas Day 2 centuries ago, on December 25th, 1899.
Bogey has this reputation as this tough guy, but actually he was born in Manhattan, in a very nice part of Manhattan. His father was a doctor, his mother was an illustrator.
His mother, Maud Humphreys, gave her little boy her family name and his first bit of fame as one of her models.
Interesting enough, he started off as an adorable little baby. We can see this in the illustrations by his mother. He was at one point identified as the Gerber baby model, but we now know that's not true.
His parents sent him to exclusive private schools in Manhattan, but he did little to distinguish himself during a line. And in real life, he honed his skill on many unsuspecting victims.
Oh, he liked to give people a business and see what they do, you know, so get reactions. Reactions were very important to him. You know, get two people together and kind of watch them go. I mean, he did that an awful lot.
But without a doubt, the most amazing aspect of Bogart's success is his staying power and appeal to modern audiences.
Because he's just cool. Humphrey Bogart is just cool. He's slick, he's cool. The women love him and the guys want to be him.
It's interesting. Why is he still cool? I mean, the toughness is really what's important, I think, because as tough as he is in the pictures and the quintessential films of his, he's still hurt. You know he's hurt. He covers it, he moves on, and he deals with it, he lives with it. And added to that, there's a sense of irony, the wisdom of irony. The world is tough, inevitably it's fatalistic, but once you understand that, we can maybe make it through.
Bogey was really one of the first anti-heroes, if not the first anti-hero. Back then, if you were good, you know, the good guys wore white hats, the bad guys wore black hats. But Bogey was able to wear a white hat and a black hat. He was the killer who you kind of sympathized with. He was the first guy really